Hello, welcome to the Spotlight. I'm Kavitah Hawaii. 750 Daesh terrorists relocated in Syria under U.S. air cover. For many, this might be shocking news if it is reported at all in the first place. For those familiar with the U.S. and when it comes to Daesh terrorists, it doesn't come as a surprise, the U.S. support for Daesh terrorists. In this case, it was a result of a prison outbreak in Syria. But what will the U.S. use these Daesh terrorists for? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at why this has attributed the attacks in Hasakah to Daesh and American occupation forces, stressing that members of the U.S.-led coalition have enrolled terrorists to spread chaos and destabilize Syria. Let's get more on this from our correspondent Muhammad Ali, who joins us from Syria's capital, Damascus. So, Muhammad, tell us the latest on this, and there are sporadic reports that say this, I guess, the whole thing has not subsided or ended really yet. There's still skirmishes that are going on.
Yes, exactly. There are still some clashes reported, perhaps in the vicinity of the Geweran prison, which Daesh sleeper cells attacked just about a week ago in order to free the other prisoners or detainees inside that prison. Now, what recently happened, according to Russian media, is that the United States forces in that governorate in Hasakah helped and transported 750 Daesh terrorists to get out from that area and then transported them to Hasakah. Perhaps, maybe according to analysts, this answers the question you just said about what is the purpose of getting those terrorists out. What is for the United States to get them out from that area to Deir el-Zor? They moved them to Abu Kamal, where analysts believe they want them to attack the Syrian army and allied forces in that area, because it's the Syrian army that is in control of Deir el-Zor's southern countryside, in Abu Kamal in particular. According to the Russian reports, the so-called Syria's Democratic Forces also retreated from 3 positions around the prison, enabling those terrorists to get out, then gather in 2 locations in Al-Hasakah to then be transported out with the help of US-led coalition reconnaissance drones towards the Abu Kamal and Deir el-Zor's southern countryside, in addition to the surroundings of a mountain called Al-Bishri over there. This is definitely not a surprise. However, there are many question marks on why the United States keeps supporting Daesh terrorist groups, especially in a lot of other accusations and reports by Russia previously in the last year that the United States is actually training Daesh terrorists in the base it occupies, the illegal base of Al-Tanf on the borderline between Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, that's what we're going to expand on with our guests, but thank you so much for mentioning that. We appreciate it. Muhammad Ali from Damascus. Well, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate, of the Spotlight, I'm sorry. We have Laith Marouf, who's an activist and political commentator, joining us from Beirut. Also joining us is Tony Gosling, who's an investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Okay, I'd like to welcome to you both. And Laith Marouf, maybe you can tell us exactly what has happened, because it might be, to an outsider, very confusing what this incident is all about, what actually went down. So why don't you tell us what you have seen and heard and read about this particular incident?
Well, definitely the situation is that the United States is not able to achieve the same goals with its SDF, what is called the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the Kurdish-Contras that it works with, which mainly is to attack the Syrian military and to expel it from the territory on the border with Iraq. We have seen that these chameleon Contras, both the Kurdish Contras and Wahhabi Contras, exchange positions whenever the United States need them to do. That's why I personally call them chameleon Contras. And in this situation, as your reporter from Syria mentioned, they are clearly indicating that they want to push back the Syrian military from Abu Kamal post, which is the most important post between the Iraq and Syria that is still under the Syrian government's control, and where the continued activities between Iraq and Syria and the axis of resistance maintain that position. So we're right now at a juncture in the situation where The Kurdish Contras have reached their limit of what they can do, and the Americans are back to their primary Contra that they've used, which is Daesh, the Wahhabi Contras. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Tony Gosling, over to you. The way that this news is reported, do you have us, Tony Gosling?
Yeah.
Okay. The way that we have this news reported is the fact that you have 750 Daesh terrorists that have relocated or were relocated in Syria under U.S. air cover. And SUVs were used, Jeeps were used, and you have some of the most dangerous Daesh terrorists from this prison under U.S. air cover. This is bringing back the notion, if it ever really went away, and I'd like to find out from you, the U.S. support for terrorists. This is a general question. What do you make of what you have heard?
Well, I mean, it seems quite obvious that as the stranglehold on the Western press, represented by the massive, the incarceration of Julian Assange and others, the idea that anybody that tells the public what's going on is going to be treated like, scapegoated Assange. This is providing increasing cover for the United States, particularly other countries too, to just get on and do whatever they want without even bothering to try and hide it. So, the idea that, they're getting intelligence help in the past, which has been covert. Now it seems that there's no attempt really to hide the strategic support which these maniacs have been getting from the United States. And this is arms, etc. So they have the only thing that really surprises me here is that this isn't really being reported at all in the West anymore. The Western public that's paying for this doesn't understand and doesn't know where their taxpayers' money is going. This whole idea that ISIS, is some sort of rogue unit, I think should be blown out of the water by this particular story. If anyone gets to hear about it, which they do in most parts of the world, but not here in the West. And that is that right from the 1980s, the United States particularly, but MI6 and Britain as well, have been encouraging basically a mercenary Islamist force, they call it. Well, this is in a way of just trying to smear the whole religion of Islam. Where from Afghanistan with the film Charlie Wilson's War, which if anyone's not seen, it's well worth watching. You can see what happened is basically private forces working through one senator in the United States were encouraging this whole idea of setting up a mercenary supposedly Muslim army to fight the Russians. And this has carried on and on through Al-Qaeda, and now we're seeing it happening right now. Look, the reason that they're in Syria is very, very clear. They're trying to roll back the successes of Assad and Russia, and they're not giving up. And what they're doing is they're using, I think it's the most disgusting thing to do, is taking the Kurdish aspirations for statehood, which, if anyone remembers, were being talked about right the way back in 1990 in the first Gulf War. Oh, we must help the Kurds to get their own country, and they're using this excuse in order to just basically use the Kurds and fund them to do the same sort of thing. So what we're looking at here is just another excuse to try and destabilize and overthrow Syria, which is part of General Wesley Clark's 7 countries in 5 years. He blew the whistle on this plan, which is to try and overthrow these countries, which the Americans seem to think that they can carry on continuing to do with no scrutiny whatsoever by the Western press.
Well, you mentioned the MI6, and I'm going to also put the CIA in that statement or in that phrase that you use, and throw this at you, Laith Marouf. In terms of these Daesh terrorists, it is not, maybe it's a good time to do this history check, where you have, in particular, this prison break had, not a prison break really, but some want to call it that. You had Swedish and Dutch ethnicities that were involved. And it's hard not to take into account the famous case of the UK-Swedish national Berlin Gildo. I don't know if you recall, it was back in 2015, where there was a prosecution that took place, but that whole thing fell apart against him because British intel sources, along with CIA, came out that they were supporting the same Syrian so-called opposition groups as he was. And then in turn, the secret operation of providing them with weapons, intel, money, financial support, etc., was coming out to the fore. So this is not something new. To what extent do you think that is going on today? I could name other examples, though maybe I'm going to address Tony Gosling there, but to what extent do you think this is going on today?
Well, look, our audience needs to understand there is really no such thing as ISIS, Daesh, or even the SDF or the Kurdish Contras. They are all just mercenary armies that change colors depending on what their masters, their paymasters, tell them to do. Maybe the lonely fighter on the ground thinks that they are truly fighting in the name of Islam, or in the situation of the Kurdish Contras that they are fighting for Kurdish liberation, but their commanders and their movers are intelligence assets, and this is all done very now openly. It's an old trick. The Saud family and the Wahhabi cult have been in the service of the British and now American imperialism since day one, since the 1930s. We don't even need to go, we go further back than Afghanistan, since the 1930s and the occupation of Mecca and Medina and the desecration of the holy sites there, destruction of the graves of the Prophet Muhammad's wives and brothers, and so this is a continuation of the same thing. And we have to understand that these are chameleon contras that change color depending on what they're told to do. In the situation of what we see right now in Syria, they are being asked to direct their activities towards the border between Iraq and Syria to cut the supply line between the axis of resistance that spans between Tehran and Damascus through Al-Bu Kamal. And we will continue to see this happening until the Americans are totally expelled from Syria, and hopefully that will be soon.
Well, looking for reasons that are coming out from Syria in terms of what has happened, there was an interesting statement made, Tony Gosling, and this was Syria's military public prosecution representative, in which he said there is an illegal U.S. military base in the Al-Tanf area near the border with Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. He said there is solid evidence, and this is something that the Russians have said time and again, along with the Syrian government. He said there is solid evidence that many members of extremist groups received training from U.S. military personnel at this military base. And at the same time, members of extremist groups were given access to the base with free movement. We've heard this before, and this is coming out again, coming from this particular Syrian representative. Do you agree? Do you think there's military training going on there? And at this point, combine that with what has happened, this 750 Daesh terrorists, some very dangerous and I guess an expertise at being a terrorist. Are they looking to make an advancement of any significance?
Well, of course, they're harassing and haranguing the Syrian government, the duly elected Syrian government. Look, I think we have to understand what's going on here. I'm not down on the ground. I can't tell if there's training going on there now or not, but I would not be at all surprised if it was. Look, you have to look at what is going on in the Middle East. The bigger picture is that these border areas are deliberately being made as blurred as possible by the tactics of the United States over there and the British, of course. The idea is to break up these countries effectively. You have to go right the way back to 1982 and the Israeli Oded Yinon plan, which spells this out. And after that, actually, there were two big reports done by the US military, part of their planning for the Middle East. This is how arrogant they are. They're basically just carving the Middle East up a bit like the British did back in the First World War, with the Sykes-Picot plan. And they're saying in 2005, the American general Thomas Barnett had this blueprint for action, which was countries that need to be destabilized. And there were quite a lot in the Middle East. He decided that the Americans were going to destabilize, followed in 2006 by Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters' plan called the New Middle East. This is a plan to balkanize the Middle East. And so to break countries up, the idea to blur the borders. And so what they want to do is to try and make, wherever there's a hard border somewhere, they want to break it up to make sure that people can pass backwards and forwards. And of course, those people generally have been refugees and of course their own fighters. And, you know, when looking at Syria, we have to just take a rain check on the casualties. 500,000 dead, at least 500,000 dead in Syria, of which at least half have been civilians. This has been the product of this NATO US-led plan. And actually, let's be quite clear, in cooperation with the Israelis, to balkanize the region so that Israel can start to expand. Mm-hmm. And also, if you go back to the beginning of the Libya so-called civil war, which was constructed by MI6 and the rest of them, there were immediately prison breaks. So what they did is they broke into prisons using special forces, and then the prisoners, as they were escaping, these are all, of course, violent criminals, most of them, but very dangerous people who should be in prison. They then destroyed all the records of the prosecuting services and the prison itself, burnt them all, whatever, destroyed them, right. And then they handed guns to those prisoners. So this is exactly the same thing going on in Syria today, as we saw, that helped spark the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi. And what a disaster that's been in Libya, with basically the country now being controlled by warlords. Well,
Leif Maruf, what makes them think that this is going to help now when you had at the height of the Syrian war, roughly in the years 2015-16, you had, 1,000 armed, what they called opposition groups. We know they were terrorists. You had an estimated 100,000 of these terrorists, mainly made up of 27 factions. I can mention the groups Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham. Of course, you had so many countries involved. Saudi Arabia, maybe they're involved at this point still. Qatar, Turkey, which we know Turkey is involved. Also the UAE, not to mention obviously the US, the UK, and the French. But they were not able to defeat the Assad government. Of course, you had Iran in its advisory role. You had Russia there. And you had, of course, the courage of these Syrian soldiers. So what makes them think that this can still happen?
Well, it's clear that
this is for Leif Maruf. I'm sorry, Tony Gosling. Go ahead, Leif
Yes,
Maruf.
they know definitely that this is not going to make a big change on the ground. But what they're hoping for is a war of attrition. Right now, they want the Syrian government and the Syrian people who are finally being, putting the country together and moving on, being able to live a normal life. They don't want none of that to happen, while the Americans are, trying to open other war fronts in Ukraine and in Taiwan. So this is just a war of attrition and a harassment. It's not going to make a big difference on the ground, but it will definitely lead to more ethnic cleansing of the Arab and Assyrian population of the northeast of Syria. And, partially this is why they, did this in Hasakah city. This is a city that, was spared most of the fighting over the last 10 years in the country. And, as we know, the plan that the Americans have had is to change the demographic of northeast Syria and bring in all these Kurdish Iraqis and Kurdish Turks to settle the land and expel the indigenous population that is Arab and Assyrian. And so this is a continuation of that on a smaller scale, not to allow the Syrian people to have any rest moment. But will it change anything on the ground? Definitely not. And those who are planning this, the military and the intelligence assets of the United States, know that this is not going to change much of the reality on the ground, but it's just going to waste more lives and waste more resources for the country.
Tony Gosling, we can't go without mentioning how the U.S. has said time and again, and you mentioned Israel also, that they are on the same page in one respect when it comes to what's happening in Syria in particular, and in Iraq also, and that is that they don't want what they call this Iranian influence. I'm not too sure what they really mean by Iranian influence. I mean, what? That we're not supposed to have regard for our neighbors? But I think one of their nightmares is coming true, and that is you have, with this 13th administration, a very let's establish and enhance our ties with our neighbors, from Turkey, Iraq obviously, Syria also there, along with other neighbors. So much so that we're also looking at the UAE to have visited Syria recently. Can't forget when you had the foreign minister, hug Bashar al-Assad. And you also have Saudi Arabia in a rapprochement type mode with Syria. The U.S. blasted the UAE for the foreign minister in particular for going to Syria and doing that. Is that something that is going against U.S. plans and may change the dynamics?
Well, look, let's use an analogy which is a bit more down to earth. So if the mafia brings somebody into a house next door to me, I'm not going to want that person to come into my living room and share a cup of tea. Whereas another one of my neighbours, I might wish to invite them in. This is really at the behest of President Assad as to whatever he wants to do. He can invite in his friends and he can politely tell his neighbours, please do not come past my front door. And that is exactly the way that the UN Charter says things should happen. So there's no problem whatsoever. If Assad wants somebody in his country, he can have them. If he doesn't want to, it's his country. And let's make it absolutely clear. There's one word that explains why President Assad is still in Damascus, and that is Putin. That is Russia. And without the Russian help and support, the same sort of support as the Americans have been giving, in intelligence-wise anyway, he would not be there. The Russians need to maintain their base in the Mediterranean. And, of course, they also want to uphold the UN Charter. So that's why. So we've also got, by the way, this is not just the Western forces, using Islamist terror groups that they control and create to create havoc around the world. They're also doing it within their own countries. We've just had the admission from the Spanish intelligence officer in court in Spain that in 2017 they blew up a bomb with the intention of blaming it on the Islamic groups, and the intelligence service of Spain was killing people inside Spain in order to destabilize the Catalan referendum.
Thank you for that. I'm going to have to jump in and give Laith Marouf 30 seconds. I'm sorry, Tony Gosling. We just got 30 seconds quickly. Laith Marouf, are we looking at this particular prison break where 750 of these Daesh terrorists have been now escaped and supposedly taken to Deir al-Zur, for there to be a forthcoming surge of any kind against Assad and his forces? 30 seconds.
I mean, look, it's a 750, terrorists is a very small number. They could create some havoc on the border in the Bukamal, but they will be crushed very fast. And this will be one of the last remnants of these activities in the land. We have to see what will happen next with these Kurdish Contras that are playing the game with them also.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. Laith Marouf, activist and political commentator from Beirut. Tony Gosling, thank you so much. Investigative journalist there from Bristol. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from me, Kaveh Taghwi, and the entire team. Just goodbye.